Hello.
And the outside unsupervised like that? Yeah.
Afternoon. So let's get started. And
You say you're reporting for
we've got 3 weeks
that's not a bad one.
of classes left in the semester. So we're going to be organizing this as follows. This week, we're going to cover adverse possession. The next week, we're going to cover land registration. The syllabus has us spending 2 weeks on settlements and trusts for sale, and I just can't see that being a thing. We might have a day on that if these other 2 topics proceed as planned. Otherwise, we'll just drop it altogether. And then the last day of the semester will be a review day. So I will prepare nothing for that day. What you guys will do is you will bring your questions, and we'll go until you guys run out of questions or until we run out of time. So just a heads up on that one. Okay. So this week we're talking about adverse possession. Okay. And there are 2 things, right? So the first question is, what is adverse possession, right? What is adverse possession? Adverse possession is the process whereby you gain ownership of land you don't own without the permission of the owner, right? So this is a mechanism whereby we can take land from the title owner and seize it, okay? So in order to engage in adverse possession, in order to receive title through adverse possession, we have to have engaged in the necessary possession for the statutory period. So you come into court and you are attempting to prove, you've brought a quiet title action, you're attempting to prove that you have adversely possessed someone's land. What is the court going to be looking for? What do you have to show? Okay. So when you read the cases, when you read the textbooks, they talk about 2 elements. Okay. They talk about factual possession, and they talk about, sometimes they call it adverse possession, sometimes they call it intent. Okay. I do not find this division especially helpful, but it is how the authorities talk about it in this region. So we need to be aware that this is how things go. Okay. Here is how I was taught to think about adverse possession. In order to show that you have adversely possessed a piece of property, you have to chain your land. You have to chain the land. Chain meaning chain. You have to engage in continuous, hostile, and adverse, notorious, and exclusive possession of the property. Wow, that's just all sorts of awful. Okay. Continuous, hostile, adverse, notorious, and exclusive. Okay. You meet these requirements, you have successfully adversely possessed the land. How does this map onto these elements here? Okay. So the answer is, it's not perfect, but here's the answer, right? Hostility, adversity, and notoriousness. Well, no. Hostility and adversity go to intent, while notoriousness and exclusivity go to facts. Okay. Continuousness has to do with the time that you have to occupy the land. Okay. So I'm going to teach you guys using this system, and you guys should map this stuff onto the authorities used here. Okay. So I'm sorry? Okay, so continuous deals with the time that you have to occupy the land. Hostile and adverse deal with the intent of the possessor. And notorious and exclusive deal with factual possession. Okay? So let's work through this in order. Okay? Continuous possession means that you have to possess for the statutory period.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
Once upon a time, I had a rule that if your phone rang in class, I got to answer it. I don't have that rule anymore. I've talked to several mothers. So what is the statutory period? Okay. And by the way, these are all statutory periods that are provided in the statutes of limitations. So the idea, so when we think about the conceptualization, right? Adverse possession is a fact. You have gone and you have taken somebody's land. And so the law's concern is not about granting you title. The law's concern is about getting you off the property you're trespassing on. Okay, so adverse possession consists of trespassing for long enough that the statute of limitations runs. Adverse possession consists of trespassing until the statute of limitations runs. Therese chain means continuous, hostile, adverse, notorious, and exclusive right here on the board. Okay. So adverse possession is trespassing for the entire length of the statute of limitations. What is that statute of limitations? It varies. It is 10 years in Barbados. It is 20 years in Bermuda. I think I think it is 30 years in St. Lucia. Okay. And I say I think because they use a slightly different terminology. And so they may not be talking about the same thing that I'm talking about. But assuming I'm reading this right, it's a 30-year statute. Everywhere else in the Caribbean, it's 12 years. Okay. So if you don't have this long of your trespassing, your adverse possession claim is done before it even starts. Okay. So when do we start the clock? And the answer is when these other elements are met. So we're going to talk about what they are over the course of the week, but the time period for continuous occupation does not start until you have hostile, adverse, notorious, and exclusive possession. Okay. But once you have these four elements, the clock runs through every possessor. Okay. So let's say, for the sake of argument, right? I have a piece of property and it's owned by X. Okay. So X owns this piece of property and A comes in and starts occupying the land, assuming that we have all these other elements, right? Starts occupying the land. And then A conveys to B, right? Let's say that A is there for 3 years. A conveys to B, who occupies for 5 years, and then conveys to C, who after 5 years files his quiet title to claim title. Thank you for answering that question. I'm sorry I missed it in the chat. Okay. C files his claim. C has only lived there for 5 years, but the vast weight of the authority says that C can tack on B's period of occupancy and A's to get him over the hump. Okay. Now, obviously, these numbers are not enough if he's in Bermuda or St. Lucia, but anywhere else that will satisfy. Okay. One of the ways that I think may be helpful to think about this, right, that was helpful for me in thinking about this, is that when A comes in and sets up his occupancy, A has the second best claim in the world to this piece of property. X has a better claim. And if X shows up and seeks to throw A out, X wins. But A has the second best claim in the world. Okay. And A can convey that claim to others and can pass his occupancy down to his heirs and successors and assigns.
Okay, so in that scenario, B and C are supposed to be heirs.
Doesn't matter. Can be heirs, can be buyers, can be successors. Anybody who follows the adverse possessor in the chain of title is entitled to use their occupancy to prove up the necessary statutory period. Yeah. So okay. one of the things that I've been struggling with as I think about this, as I try and sort of give you guys to understand this is, what if we change the hypo here? And so instead of A conveying to B in some mechanism, let's say that B is an adverse possessor and has dispossessed A. Does the clock restart? Do we now have two clocks running, right? A clock with regard to X and a clock with regard to A? I don't know. I can't find any cases on this. So,
Sir, did you say basically A is an adverse possessor and B adversely possesses from the adverse possessor?
right. This is the situation that I don't have an answer to.
But then wouldn't it be, I mean, for me personally, wouldn't it be the clock continues because the principle seems like it comes into play where it's taken from the title. So seeing as A was adversely possessing, I mean, B would be the title, right?
Right. But given this break in this chain, is B entitled to add A's occupancy to their clock? Or does the clock start over again? That's the part that I don't have an answer to. Right? I agree with you that we're still, we're still interested in dispossessing the title owner. But the hard part about this question is, what does this period of occupancy do for the running of the clock? Okay. So Rehan says that basically adverse possession is rewarding squatting. I mean, yes. But really what it is punishing is not being engaged with your property. Okay, if someone is able to occupy your property for 10 years and it never occurs to you to dispossess them, right, to remove them, maybe the better use of the property is that we assign it to the person who's actually making use of it. So this is the policy judgment, is that, hey, property owners should be engaged with their assets. And if you're not, well, then somebody who is should be allowed to have it. Okay. So does this continuous issue make sense, right? The notion of tacking on the past adverse possessors. Be good on this. Okay, not exactly. What's still confusing? My discussing of the clock and the timing. Right, yeah. So we have this property, it's owned by X. X is not really important. We just have to establish that they do exist, okay, for the hypo. A comes in, they're a squatter, okay. They have a period of occupancy that does not run for the entire statutory period. Okay, at any point during A's occupancy, X could have come along and said, hey, get the hell off my property. Or if you prefer, get off my lawn. Come on, guys. So A absolutely has no title with regard to X. But as part of establishing these other elements that we'll talk about in a minute, A has to be willing to throw off the property anybody else in the world who shows up who is not X. Okay. We're gonna put a pin in that, Johnny, when I finish explaining this, and then we'll approach this. So A has this title, this alleged title, that allows them to exclude the whole world except for X. And then they convey that interest to B. B is allowed to count A's occupancy period as if B had been the one occupying. Okay? Johnny, I'm not sure I understand your question, but let me see if I can understand it, right? We go back to our original hypo where B is not dispossessing A. Let's say that instead of A conveying to B, what if A gets married to B and they're living together, occupying the property? Exactly right, Justin. Okay, exactly right. Then this would all be one period of occupancy, right? Because A just continues, and then they sell it to C, and the same as before, where C can tack on their possession. Right, the timeline of squatting does not reset. Okay, once the squatting starts, then the clock is running for X. Okay, because remember, this is about the time period during which X can bring an action to eject the squatters. Okay, once the time has run, then the squatters can take action to establish their title and say, hey, look, we were here for the whole period. He never brought an ejectment. He can't bring one now. Okay. Okay. So do we feel like we have a better grip on this now? Okay, good, great. All right, you've had your chance to jump in and say, wait. So we're gonna move on. All right. So hostile occupation. Hostile occupation means that the adverse possessor is removing, right, is not allowing, oh, My notes are useless. Let me make sure. I don't want to, I really don't want to give you bad information. Okay. Right. Sorry. Hostility means that there can't be permission from the title owner. Okay, so what this means is that if you are a licensee, okay, or a tenant, you cannot be an adverse possessor. That's not how it works. Okay, so X says to A, sure, you can come and stay on the property. You can live here. You can build yourself a house, right? And then 20 years later, A comes along and says, oh, wait, I've been here this whole time and you haven't taken any action against me. So now I own the property. Because the permission obviates all of that. Okay? But there's a wrinkle. This seems like this is one of the things that you guys will learn is that this is how law is, right? You think it's easy, and then, oh, but wait, there are complications. Okay? So there are cases, I'm trying to remember where the case was. I think it was in Trinidad. I can't swear to that. But the case is the title owner gives permission to the squatter to come onto the land until they have the money to buy it. So the idea is you're gonna buy this land, but you got to save up the money to buy it. And in the meantime, you need somewhere to live. So you can live on the land. And once you have the money, you can buy it. But the squatter never actually gets the money together. There's always something, right? Always something. Car breaks down, you broke your leg, you got to go on vacation, whatever. So the squatter never actually has the money. Owner dies and gets replaced by their heir who goes, hey, you, get off my property. And the squatter says, hey, wait a minute. I've been here for 12 years or whatever. If it was Trinidad, then it's 12 years. And so now I own this land. Screw you, buddy. This case winds up turning on a specific wrinkle of landlord-tenant law that you will learn in more detail in Real Property 2. But the wrinkle is this. Because there was a promise to buy the property, the squatter was not a licensee. The permission was not in the form of a license. It was in the form of a tenancy at will. And the problem, as we've discussed earlier in the semester, is that tenancies at will can end at any point. And so when do we determine that a tenancy at will has ended and a tenant has begun hostile possession or adverse possession? And the court says that the answer is after 1 year of a tenancy at will, it's over. It's done. You are no longer a tenant. You are now a trespasser. And you are engaged in hostile possession. And so at that point is when the clock starts to run. Because the other three requirements had been met the whole time, but the question was, when did the hostile possession start? Did it start when the heir said, "Get off my property," in which case the squatter loses, or did it start earlier in time? And the court winds up ruling that it started earlier in time. It started after 1 year of occupancy, and so the squatter won. Okay? So do we understand the notion behind hostile possession, right? So what's required and sort of the complication. Alyssa, if I remember correctly, I think there was a reference to a statute that specifically provided that for tenancies at will, they terminate after 1 year if there's no evidence of continuation. So I think that's right. I think that was, I think that the 1 year rule was specific to that jurisdiction, which the more I think about it, the more I think it really was Trinidad. Okay. So do we understand the concepts behind hostile possession, right? The idea that if the title owner is giving you permission to stay, you can't be an adverse possessor. The complications are complicated, but the concept is relatively simple. Permission kills your claim forever, right? If you are operating under a continuous grant of permission, here endeth the inquiry. The only issue becomes if there's a possibility that your permission could have been withdrawn at some point. Yeah, go ahead, Maisha. You've got your hand raised.
Yes, I was asking, you said that permission negates the claim, but what if the permission was given for you to...
1 second, we're not hearing you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
No,
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yes. Can you hear me now?
No, we're not hearing you. Maybe put your question in the chat.
Okay.
Yes, permission negates the claim. If the owner granted permission, what if the permission was given for 3 years, right? Then the clock starts at the end of the 3 years. So in this circumstance, you've only had 7 years of possession and you don't meet the necessary time period. Okay. What we're trying to do when we look at whether there's permission and whether it's withdrawn is we're trying to see if you have the hostility for the necessary continuous time period. This also means, by the way, that, right, going back to our A, B, C situation, is that if the title owner comes along, say in year 5 or year 6, sees the squatter and goes, okay, you can stay. Clock starts again at the point that the title owner withdraws that permission. Make sense? How do we feel about hostility? Feel good about it? Well, hopefully you don't feel good about hostility in general. Right. That's exactly right, Justin. If you are given permission to stay, you are not an adverse possessor. If you are given permission to stay, you are not an adverse possessor because you're not hostile to the title owner. Oh, well, you're logged in under Justin's display name. So, Johnny, I think the part you didn't hear was just a joke, so don't worry about it. Okay. Let's take this one at a time. Nicole asks, is giving and taking permission clear cut? Are these obvious? And the answer is not always, right? What if the title owner comes along, sees the squatter on the property, and then just goes away and doesn't do anything? Has permission been granted? Maybe, right? There are courts that come down one way, courts that come down the other. What if the squatter builds a fence and a gate, and the title owner comes along, says, hey, you can't do that, but doesn't take any further action? Is that permission or not? I don't think that's as close a question. I think there are more courts that say, no, it's not, because the title owner has said, hey, you can't do that. Okay. But you will find authorities that go the other way that say, look, if you want to protect your rights as the title owner, you got to actually do something. You can't just complain. Okay. All right. So Nicole, does that answer your question? Great. Awesome. All right. So now, Tiffany. Okay. If permission is not valid after 1 year, then the person has to take away the permission within that year. No. So this circumstance, right, the Trinidadian case that I talked about, that's a specific situation related to the promise to buy, which the court said created a tenancy at will. Okay. Now, the reasoning of the court in getting from this fact to the legal conclusion of a tenancy at will, not entirely sure, like the logic of that. There seems to be something missing here. But this is what they did, okay? Because the squatter had a tenancy at will, she came under the protection of a statute that ended that tenancy after a year. And so after that, she was engaged in hostile possession. That's why there's the specific 1 year issue in that case. Okay. But like the heir in that case argued that instead of a tenancy at will, that the squatter had a license. And if she'd had a license, she would have lost, because that license would have gone on until it was revoked. And so the permission would have just continued on until the heir provided the notice to quit. Okay. So Tiffany, does that answer your question? Do you feel like you have a better grip on this now? Great. Awesome. Okay. So now, well, before we move on, what other questions do you guys have about hostility? Adversity. Adversity gets very complicated, particularly in the Caribbean, where some of the courts have followed the lead of English courts and some have followed the lead of American courts. So let me start by explaining the oldest rule, which is still the rule in the United States and is followed in certain Caribbean jurisdictions. That will probably get us to the end of class today, and then we'll pick up with the English rule and the rest of what is the modern English rule and the rest of the Caribbean, okay? So the old rule was that the intent of the squatter did not matter. What mattered was the intent of the title owner, which meant that in order for possession to be adverse, you had to make use of the land that was inconsistent with the intent of the title owner. You had to make use in a way that was inconsistent with the intent of the title owner. Let me give you an example, okay? You own a piece of property, and let's say you own it in St. Lucie, and you have let it run wild, and it's overgrown and gone back into its natural state. And then a squatter comes along. So under the old rule, since I've been asked to repeat this, under the old rule, for a squatter's possession to be adverse, it had to be contrary to the intent of the title owner. Okay, so that's the concept. I'm trying to illustrate it now for you guys. Okay? Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is the old common law rule, which is still followed in the United States. Okay? And there are places in the Caribbean that follow this rule. So you've got your property in St. Lucie, it's run wild, somebody comes along and builds a sugar plantation on this property, right? Says I'm gonna start farming sugar on this property, and 10 years later, because it's Barbados, 10 years later, they file suit to quiet title. If you come in as the title owner and you say, well, you know, I was letting it run wild, but honestly, I was probably going to build a sugar plantation on it when I got around to developing it. If the court believes you, right, there's a credibility issue there, but if the court believes you, the squatter loses because their use is not consistent or is not inconsistent with your intentions. But if you come in and you've got a letter to your cousin where you say, oh yeah, people are moving to St. Lucie, I'm going to build an apartment building on this property that I own, then the squatter wins because the sugar plantation would be inconsistent with your intentions. Okay? So what questions do you have about the old common law rule for adversity? Any questions? What questions? Sure. So the question for the court in determining adversity under the old rule, what we can call the American rule, okay? The question for the court is, what is the intent of the title owner? Okay. What is the intent of the title owner? So we asked the title owner, what are you going to do with this property? And if that statement, if what the title owner says is inconsistent with the use the squatter is making, the squatter wins. But if the title owner says, oh yeah, I was going to do what they were doing anyway, then under the old rule, it is not adverse. Okay? Does this make sense now? Are we still confused? Right, exactly right. If it is inconsistent, it is adverse. And again, this is the old rule. This is pre-1833. Okay? And which is why it's the American rule. So we feel good about the American rule. Okay, good. Good. All right. So on Thursday, we'll go through the English rule, right? The modern English rule. We'll talk a little bit about like how courts in the Caribbean have sort of come down on both sides of that. And then we'll talk about notorious and exclusive. Okay. All right. Last chance for questions. And that's my cue to call it a day. Take care, and I'll see you guys later.